Welcome to the podcast of All Means All. In this episode, Angele Deguara, Jessica Lament, and Thomas Shaughnessy will talk about inclusive school culture.
What is inclusive school culture?
So, to answer that question, I think first we have to start with understanding what a culture is. When we use the term culture, it can be used in different contexts, usually refers to a community or a society, but every social group or social institution can have a culture, of course. And here we are talking about educational culture. So when we say culture, we are referring to a set of values, a philosophy, norms, ways of doing things, ways of looking at life, ways of looking at anything in particular. So when we say culture, there are also elements of culture which are material or more tangible. There are then other elements of culture which are less tangible, like the values I mentioned before, or the norms, or the beliefs, or the attitudes. And then there are other elements which are more tangible or physical, what we do, what we produce, how we do things, and so on. So all this then can be applied to any context. And here we are talking about school cultures. So the culture we find in educational institutions. So that applies within school culture, within an educational institution. We are talking about a culture. So we usually use the word ethos rather than culture. When we say the culture of a school, we are talking about the philosophy of the school, the philosophy that is practiced, or the philosophy that the leadership of the school would like to have in that school. So it is about the values, the norms, the material things, the practices, the traditions of the school, and so on. It's never ending, you know. So you asked me about what an inclusive school culture is. So now we come to the actual question. So when you can have different school cultures, of course, you can have school cultures which are inclusive, others which are less inclusive, or others which are not inclusive at all. So an inclusive school culture is a culture which gives importance to diversity, which would like to give space to everyone, which would like to see that the school, ensure that the school is a safe space for everyone, and which ensures that everyone in the community, students, staff, and everyone who is a member of the community feels that they belong, no? A sense of belonging. An inclusive school culture embraces diversity and promotes diversity and facilitates diversity. I think I have said enough, so maybe someone else would like to add to what I said.
One of the other elements to an inclusive school culture is around all students being able to realize their full potential. So including the sense of belonging that's there and the community that's built there, that everyone is able to and supported to realize what is their full potential.
May I just add something else, because and you find this also in the literature. When you look up an inclusive school culture, you find a lot of literature focusing on students with special needs. Here we are looking at school culture in a broader way. So it's not just about students with special needs. We are looking at every individual in the school community or within the educational community who have needs. Everyone has needs. So inclusion is not just about including students who have disabilities or special needs. It is about including everyone, regardless of social background, social class, regardless of race, ethnicity, ability, sexual orientation, age, if it applies. Yes, of course it applies, because we are talking about the whole community, it's not just the students, you know, so that is a point we would like to make as well.
How is inclusive school culture implemented?
We've discussed many different ways that it can be implemented because it's so representative of the students in the community that it's serving. So what inclusion would look like in one school might have different examples than another school. But the 4 things that we've discussed as being very important in making sure that inclusive school culture is realized is around the idea of attitudes, around collaboration and the necessity to collaborate at many different levels, is around knowledge and continuing to develop knowledge and grow in understanding, and lastly around the importance of leadership and how leadership shapes what kind of school culture grows, and hopefully it's one of inclusion. So the first area is around really building attitudes. And the 2 elements around attitudes that are important is, one, that it's something where people feel there's an openness, there's an empathy, an attitude of we're creating a safe space, that people are welcome to come, that there's an attitude of acceptance to who is a part of the school, and that we want to grow and understand who is there already. And the other element of it is that we're willing to learn. So if we're open to learning and we're willing to understand more, we can grow our attitudes to be ones that are open to inclusion in many different facets.
So we discussed the challenge, because Thomas was speaking about challenges or obstacles that an educational institution may face when it comes to this stage of implementation, that you may need to change attitudes very often in practice. Those who embark on such a huge project to respond to all this diversity will probably have to work at changing attitudes. Of course, there would be, hopefully, people in the community who do not need a lot of changing, but of course we are dealing with a large community of people who may have racist attitudes, who may be homophobic, who may have problems with migrants, you know, being part of the educational community. So regardless of what we're talking about, regardless of what type of diversity we are talking about, that is a huge challenge, because attitudes don't change so easily. You can make rules, you can, you know, have a lot of initiatives when it comes to maybe leadership, for example. So the administration of the school may have a lot of programs in mind, but changing attitudes is very, very difficult, you know, because as we said, the culture is about a lot about attitudes, a lot about philosophies and ways of doing things and ways of approaching things, you know, so that is a very, very challenging, you know, task, a very challenging task. We were in fact mentioning when we were discussing how, for example, a school may organize CRPD programs, but you have the challenge then of attracting teachers to attend if they're not compulsory. If they are compulsory, you have the challenge, you know, of teachers resisting this, feeling that it is being imposed. And if it is not compulsory, if it is voluntary, then you may attract the people who are already open to inclusion. And those who don't will not attend. So these are all challenges you know, we are speaking of attitudes and maybe touching on other issues, but changing attitudes is a very huge challenge.
I think the other areas around implementation of inclusive school culture is around collaboration. And as Angele was saying, it's something that is around a dialogue and it's around attitudes, but it's also around how you build systems that allow for there to be multi-level collaboration. So you're building a place where students are encouraged to collaborate together, they're encouraged to collaborate with their teachers, teachers are collaborating, you have leadership that's bringing collaboration in from the community, from families, maybe even from further organizations. So you have many levels of collaboration happening that allows for there to be more exposure to different attitudes and potentially deal with some of that resistance that you can get from attitudes that you've not met before, and to deal with some of the unconscious bias that can come from that. Collaboration is also about bringing in people who might be able to offer a different perspective with knowledge that they have from other areas of their lives or what the community has happening in it. So we have then collaboration happening at many levels, and between that collaboration, the relationships can be built that facilitate that change of attitude that might need to happen in order for more inclusion to be possible.
You can have collaboration between schools as well to learn about good practices, for example. Collaboration with the authorities is important, with departments of education that may also resist or may not support financially or in terms of other things. I don't know. Maybe they won't approve of a project that a school presents. You know? So as Jessica said, collaboration works on many levels.
Yeah, sorry, it was just one of the things that we mentioned as well as, about fostering this more inclusive school culture was about addressing this in initial teacher education, and about how, having student teachers think that, a lot of what happens in inclusive culture is part of what is their normal process. So when they're a student learning about inclusive education, inclusive culture, that becomes part of the norm. So when they go into, when they're newly qualified teachers and they go into a school, they take those skills and that knowledge with them. So they automatically start to implement those more inclusive practices. They promote more collaboration. They're interested in sharing ideas. So for us, we think that, changing a culture is a slow process. So by bringing it in through initial teacher education, we can slowly and gradually change the kind of ethos and school culture that we have within our schools, and eventually we'll start to see them naturally become more inclusive. So that's just kind of one way that we thought is, a really good way to start addressing school culture, because it will always be a kind of a slow process.
Yeah. Well, and I think it comes from that readiness to have a dialogue, and for the feedback from a dialogue to be one that allows people to make changes and grow from it as that feedback is taken in. When you're collaborating on all of those levels, you then have much more feedback to use to determine how are we going to continue this process, the slow process, the intentional process of becoming more inclusive and building a more inclusive school culture.
And I think parents are also important in this, in this collaboration with parents. You don't have to work closely with parents or necessarily include them in everything you do, but communicating to parents about their important role, because what happens in school and what happens inside the family goes together. So when you have the support of parents, or when the parents know what is happening inside the school, it could also be that what happens inside the school could reach the parents also through the students themselves, or through the children that we teach.
And Jessica mentioned, about inclusive leadership and the important role that plays in inclusive school culture. But one of the barriers that we talk a lot about when, it's very good to have someone who's got that attitude, who wants to promote inclusion within their school. But if they don't have that kind of resources and that support from other teachers, from school management, from every kind of facet, then it's very difficult to kind of instigate that, because we need the resources to develop the stuff, to develop materials, to get in the right colleagues that we need to support our students.
And to have the time.
Exactly.
I think time is a resource, isn't it?
And that's it as well. It's one of those things, like if you want to, investigate on projects that are based around a more inclusive practice, teachers need to be given that time. They need to be given that time away, or whether it's a buyout or whatever it is, to investigate these projects, to investigate these, I guess, well, not projects, but investigate practices where they can make their school more inclusive. So schools need to recognize that, we need to allocate that time if we want to really start to change that culture within the school.
Another element of implementation around inclusive school and culture is around knowledge, and how knowledge is intentional, and having the knowledge that you need in order to be able to be inclusive to the groups of students that you have or the community that you have is an important piece. So it's looking at it in a proactive way and making sure that you as the educator or you as the leader potentially are one that's taking into account all the different elements and the diversity that you have in front of you, and making sure that you're looking at it with a lot of intention. How can I draw in all of these elements of diversity? How can I make sure that I'm proactive in seeking out resources that represent the students I'm teaching, or information that might need to enhance the work that students are already doing in an area? So making sure that you're using all that you have before you arrive at the moment where you need it is an important part of building that knowledge base in order to be as inclusive as possible.
And knowledge can be of varying degrees or formalities, such as, for example, you may get knowledge through formal research. For example, you can enhance the knowledge of the educational community through the provision of training, for example. Another way of enhancing your knowledge is to listen to others, to maybe learn more about the life of your students, or maybe to learn more about the culture of a colleague which is different from yours, who's coming from a different background, maybe from a different ethnic group. Maybe we have students who come from a different religion, and the majority of students and you yourself come from a different religious background. So you might have all the good intentions in the world, but you don't know enough about how to cater for this diversity. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to embark on this large, project, doing research and so on, but it's important to know that we don't know it all. We on every level, it could be the educators, it could be the administrators, it could be anyone in the community who needs to be aware that in order to implement an inclusive culture successfully, we have to have the knowledge. We have to be sensitive to the needs of the students that we cater for, to our colleagues, to the needs of everyone in the community. So knowledge can come in different ways, That's very important. To design policies, for example. We will speak about this later, but how can you plan programs, or design policies to have this inclusion, this culture of inclusion, if you are not sensitive enough to the needs of the educational community?
Yeah, we also talked about, inclusive culture and learning it's in terms of knowledge, it's a continuous journey. You're always learning more. There's always ways you can learn to improve and support people in a more inclusive way. So for us, it's one of those things where we always see it as, I guess, it's never finished really. It's something that you can always learn more, and you can always better support those in your community.
And we are facing new realities every time, all the time. We are facing new realities. So we have to cater for different experiences or different students coming from different backgrounds, for example, migrants, LGBT, members of the LGBT community. We're learning all the time. It's ongoing, it's never ending. But that's why attitudes are very important, because you have to be open to embracing all this diversity, and open to learning more.
Yeah, so the other thing that we had already mentioned was about leadership and the impact that can have on inclusive school culture. And for us, a lot of that we see is kind of in modeling that kind of inclusive behavior. We see if we see it from the top, then it's a lot easier for those in the middle to kind of replicate what they see at kind of senior level, so they know that this is kind of the values that this school stands for.
One of the last elements in terms of implementation that's important for inclusive school culture has to do with leadership. And when we have leadership that is not only fully embracing the idea and the beliefs that go into an inclusive school culture, they're also modeling to everyone in the community what it looks like. So they're embodying the attitudes. They are facilitating the collaboration. They are actively seeking out knowledge of their own. So they are acting as this model for everyone in the community to see how we can continue to build in this idea of inclusive school culture. They're modeling, but simultaneously they're also facilitating others and leveraging the skills and strengths of others around them in order to make the entire community stronger. So bringing forth strengths, bringing together ideas, working as someone that is always fostering that idea of collaboration amongst all the different members of the community, make that leader one that's really showing how not only having those values are an important piece, but how we act on those values matters more in many cases. One of the many challenges that has to do with leadership is about meeting the resistance of some of the staff you might have who are not in the same place on the journey towards inclusivity, and trying to bring along people in the community to understand everyone who's involved in creating the school culture at all needs to be involved in understanding how to become more inclusive. And that's one of the big challenges of a school leader.
Yeah, what Jessica was talking about is leadership that is open to inclusion. Of course, apart from what you already mentioned, such a leadership could also have challenges when it comes to collaboration from, for example, funding sources from departments or authorities. What I would also like to mention, however, is that when the leadership of a school is not so open to diversity, that is maybe a much bigger challenge, especially for members of the community, such as teachers and maybe new teachers, new graduates who come with a lot of ideas and would like to implement them, but they find a lot of obstacles or maybe lack of awareness. Doesn't have to be, a leadership which actively stops members of the community from trying to achieve a culture of inclusion. It could also be leadership that is not sensitive enough. So what can we do in such a situation? We believe that we can still try to do something. We can do things on different levels. For example, in our classrooms, we can start with our classrooms. We can maybe try to work with colleagues. We can try to explain to the leadership of the school why we think that we should do this and not this, why we think that a culture of inclusion would be more beneficial. So, that is more difficult, but we can always start somewhere. Of course, unless you have a leadership that is completely opposed to inclusion, maybe we wouldn't be so unlucky as to work in such an environment. That would be much more difficult, of course, to challenge and to overcome.
So I think those are the big areas that really are necessary to implement effectively an inclusive school culture. And whether you're talking about a school, they're talking about a preschool setting or a primary school setting, a secondary school setting, higher education, all of those settings still require the same pieces in order to make sure that it's truly an inclusive school culture for everyone who's there. It always will come back to attitudes, collaboration, the knowledge that's required, and leadership, whether it's leadership within your classroom or leadership within the school as a whole.
Why is inclusive school culture so important?
We are living in a society which is very diverse and becoming increasingly diverse all the time. So educational communities have to address this diversity. The need is being felt even more nowadays. Educational communities themselves are reflections of the wider society, and societies have become more diverse nowadays. So, first of all, it has become urgent in a way. It is a duty for educators and educational communities, schools, to do something about this diversity, to respond to this diversity, to respond to the needs of everyone in the educational community, to ensure that everyone enjoys this, feels this sense of belonging. Because we know, and Jessica and Thomas can say more about this, but research shows that when students feel this sense of belonging, when people who are part of this educational community feel this sense of belonging, they perform better. They feel loved, they feel cared for, they feel special. When it comes to educational performance, there is evidence in the literature which shows that when students feel accepted, feel represented in the curriculum, feel represented in the symbols, in the rituals of the school, feel represented in the language that is used in the school. In the language, I don't mean English or French or Italian here. I mean how we speak about diversities, how we speak about different communities, how we speak about persons with disability, how we speak about different sexual orientations, how we speak about anything, you know, social classes, people coming from different backgrounds and so on. So there is evidence which shows that when there is an inclusive school culture, it is beneficial to everyone.
Yeah, I think along that is that we see student self-esteem rises, and when self-esteem rises, we see student success rise. So there's evidence that shows that when students believe in themselves, they then perform academically better. We also see that when there's increased participation, when there's increased engagement in classes and lessons in school, that there's less dropout rates, that there's less children skipping school, that there's less failing of standardizing. Less discrimination. Less failing of standardized exams or other measures that would be considered really high stakes testing. So we see all these outcomes that, as you extrapolate them out, then end up in greater student success because they're able to reach academic levels that are higher, they're able to reach a sense of self, a sense of self-worth, pride in their work, connection to their community that in turn brings forward this well-being piece, which has to proceed there from the progress or the growth that they could make. So we see all of these outcomes that then show us how important inclusivity is and how important it is for students to feel that as they move through school and then beyond school, so that society itself is one that represents everyone that's there in a way that's truly holistic, that's truly meaningful for all the people that are in that community.
I mentioned discrimination, and with discrimination, you can mention other things like shame and stigma, and hate and bullying. A lot of things that we know happen within education institutions, unfortunately. And if we manage to fight this will also maybe eventually reflect in the wider society, because even students themselves can maybe pass on the message directly or indirectly to their parents, or maybe to their friends, and it can also have a multiplier effect. Of course, this is a very optimistic way of looking at this. We know that there are a lot of difficulties, but in the end, we believe that it's worth, working for.
And ultimately, it also is about reducing social inequities that exist. And as we do that, we then create a more equitable society. So ultimately, for students to be able to live those experiences and see what it feels like to have someone advocate for them, learn how to advocate for themselves. And in time, as that slow process evolves, was one that results in a more equitable society for everyone.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of All Means All. In the show notes, there is a link to the chapter in the open textbook. There you can find the transcript of the video and more information on the topic.